Zixthara floated in the observation chamber of the research vessel Serenity's Edge, watching the strange ship drift through space like a wounded animal. The vessel looked primitive compared to the sleek curves of Kaleth technology, all harsh. Angles and crude metal plating that spoke of desperate repairs made with whatever materials could be found. Smoke leaked from several sections, and entire portions of the hull showed blast damage from weapons fire. The Kaleth xenobiologist adjusted the viewing screen to get a better look at this new species they had encountered. 3 cycles ago, their long-range sensors had detected the distress signal coming from the outer rim of the Vega sector, and Captain Morthak had ordered an immediate course change to investigate. The Kaleth Confederation prided itself on peaceful first contact with new species, and Zixthara felt the familiar excitement of meeting beings they had never seen before. The damaged ship had responded to their hails with caution, transmitting basic mathematical sequences and star charts to establish communication. What followed was a crude but effective translation protocol that allowed basic conversation within hours. The beings called themselves humans, and they claimed to be refugees fleeing from something they called devourers. Captain Jake Morrison appeared on the main screen, his face bearing scars that told of recent violence. Zixthara studied the human features with scientific interest, noting the forward-facing eyes of a predator species and the way Morrison's gaze constantly shifted as if looking for threats even during peaceful conversation. The human wore a uniform that had seen better days, patched in multiple places and bearing burn marks from energy weapons. "We appreciate your offer of assistance," Morrison said through the translation system, his voice carrying an odd mixture of gratitude and wariness. "Our ship took heavy damage during our escape, and we have wounded aboard who need medical attention." Captain Morthak, speaking for the Kaleth delegation, offered their standard humanitarian aid package. "We have advanced medical facilities and can provide repairs for your vessel. Our xenobiologists are eager to learn about your species and establish peaceful relations." Zixthara watched Morrison's reaction with interest. Instead of the relief most species showed when offered Kaleth assistance, the human seemed to grow, more alert. His eyes swept across what he could see of the Kaleth bridge, and Zixthara noticed how he seemed to be memorizing details of their technology and crew positions. When Morrison agreed to the assistance, he insisted that only small groups would transport between ships, and that both sides would maintain their own security protocols. The first group of humans to board the Serenity's Edge consisted of Morrison, a scientist named Dr. Lisa Park, and an engineer called Ben Carter. What struck Zixthara immediately was how they moved. Even in the supposedly safe environment of the Kaleth ship, the humans never fully relaxed. Dr. Park examined everything, with the curiosity of a scientist, but also with the careful attention of someone looking for weaknesses or escape routes. Ben Carter studied the Kaleth technology with obvious admiration, yet Zixthara caught him making quick sketches on a small device, as if recording everything for later analysis. During the tour of the medical facilities, Dr. Park asked detailed questions about Kaleth physiology that seemed innocent, but made Zixthara uncomfortable. The human doctor wanted to know about their nervous system, their reaction times, what kinds of toxins might affect them, and how their sensory organs functioned. When questioned about these interests, Dr. Park simply smiled and said she wanted to make sure any future medical cooperation would be effective. Lieutenant Amy Collins arrived with the second group of humans, and she immediately drew Zixthara's attention. The human female moved with the fluid grace of a warrior, her hand never straying far from the weapon at her side. Even when Captain Morthak assured her that the Serenity's Edge was completely safe, Collins continued to scan corners and exits as if mapping the ship for potential combat situations. The refugees from the human ship told a disturbing story as they received medical treatment. They spoke of worlds consumed entirely, of species that gave no warning before attack, and of colonies that simply vanished without trace. The humans described the devourers as something beyond reason or negotiation, beings that viewed all matter as food to be consumed. What unsettled Zixthera was not just the story itself, but the matter-of-fact way the humans told it, as if such horrors were simply part of normal existence. Ben Carter worked alongside Calith engineers to repair the human ship, and Zixthera observed how quickly he learned their technology. Within hours, Carter was suggesting modifications that the Calith engineers admitted were clever improvements. Yet something about his enthusiasm made the xenobiologist uneasy. Carter didn't just want to fix his ship, he wanted to understand every system on the Calith vessel, asking questions about power generation, shield frequencies, and weapon capabilities that seemed to go beyond mere curiosity. When evening came, and the humans prepared to return to their ship, Morrison made a request that surprised the Calith. He asked if some of his people could remain aboard the Serenity's Edge overnight, not as guests, but as what he called a cultural exchange. Captain Morthak agreed readily, pleased by this apparent gesture of trust. Only later did Zixthera realize that the humans Morrison left behind were all technical specialists and warriors. Dr. Park remained to study Calith biology, Ben Carter stayed to learn about their engineering, and Lieutenant Collins requested permission to observe Calith security procedures. The humans weren't staying as guests, Zixthera realized with growing unease. They were staying to learn everything they could about potential allies who might someday become enemies. As the cycles passed and the combined fleet prepared to escort the human refugees to safety, Zixthera found themselves increasingly fascinated and disturbed by these new beings. The humans expressed gratitude for Calith assistance, but they also prepared for the possibility that such assistance might not always be available. Every conversation seemed to serve multiple purposes. Every gesture of friendship came with careful observation and analysis. The xenobiologist began to suspect that while the Calith were conducting first contact according to their peaceful protocols, the humans were conducting a completely different kind of assessment. They weren't just grateful refugees seeking aid, they were survivors who had learned to evaluate every new encounter as either an opportunity or a threat, and they were preparing for both possibilities with equal thoroughness. The combined fleet moved through hyperspace toward human territory, and Zixthera spent the journey studying their unexpected guests with growing fascination. The Calith had offered temporary quarters aboard their larger ships to ease overcrowding on the damaged human vessels, and this arrangement gave the xenobiologist unprecedented access to observe human behavior in what they assumed was a relaxed environment. Dr. Sam Rodriguez, the chief medical officer from the human ship Aurora Dawn, had set up a temporary clinic in the Calith medical bay. Zixthera watched him work with quiet efficiency, treating both human and Calith patients with equal skill. What struck the observer was how Rodriguez had reorganized the medical supplies according to what he called triage priorities. When asked about this system, Rodriguez explained that medical resources should always be arranged for rapid access during emergencies. "You never know when everything might go wrong," Rodriguez said while showing Zixthera the modified storage system. "We keep the critical supplies closest to hand, then work outward based on what we'll need if we're treating mass casualties under combat conditions." The human spoke of combat medical scenarios as if they were routine workplace situations, describing procedures for treating wounded while under fire and techniques for performing surgery during ship-to-ship battle. Zixthera found this perspective deeply unsettling. The Calith medical system was designed for peaceful conditions, with elaborate procedures and plenty of time for careful diagnosis. Rodriguez had restructured their entire approach around the assumption that medical care would often need to be provided while people were actively trying to kill them. Sergeant Rick Hayes had taken it upon himself to organize what he called basic preparedness training for the civilian refugees. Zixathara observed these sessions with growing alarm, watching as Hayes taught children barely old enough to walk how to recognize different types of weapon fire by sound alone. Elderly refugees learned hand signals for silent communication and practiced moving quickly through ship corridors without making noise. When Zixathara questioned the necessity of teaching such skills to non-combatants, Hayes looked genuinely puzzled by the question. "Everyone needs to know how to stay alive," he said simply. "You can't predict who's going to be in the wrong place when trouble starts, so everyone needs basic survival skills." The sergeant went on to explain that human children typically learned weapon handling, basic first aid, and emergency procedures as naturally as they learned to read and write. The concept troubled Zixathara deeply. Kaleth society was built on specialization, with warriors handling security while civilians pursued intellectual and artistic endeavors. The idea that every member of a species would need combat training suggested a level of constant danger that the Kaleth had never experienced. Communications Officer Kate Williams had established a cultural exchange program with young Kaleth crew members, ostensibly to help both species learn each other's languages and customs. Zixathara sat in on several of these sessions and gradually realized that Williams was conducting something much more sophisticated than simple cultural exchange. She was systematically learning about Kaleth psychology, social structure, decision-making processes, and leadership hierarchies. During one session, Williams asked seemingly innocent questions about how Kaleth society handled disagreements and whether there had ever been conflicts between different Kaleth groups. She wanted to know about their government structure, their military organization, and their technological development priorities. When a young Kaleth engineer mentioned that their species had never experienced large-scale warfare, Williams's expression grew very thoughtful. "That must be nice," Williams said quietly. "We've never known a time without some kind of conflict somewhere. Even during our most peaceful periods, we're usually preparing for the next threat." She explained that human history was essentially one long chain of warfare, with brief periods of peace used primarily to develop better weapons and strategies for the next inevitable conflict. Commander Alex Turner, the senior pilot among the refugees, entertained mixed groups of humans and Kaleth with what he called war stories during off-duty hours. Zixathara initially thought these were fictional tales meant for amusement, but gradually realized Turner was describing actual combat experiences. The human spoke casually of battles against alien raiders, of suicide missions to destroy enemy installations, and of desperate fights for survival on hostile worlds. What disturbed Zixathara most was how Turner's Kaleth audience reacted to these stories. They listened with fascination and horror, treating the tales as exciting fiction. Turner, meanwhile, told them with the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing routine work experiences. The human clearly expected such violence as a normal part of existence, while the Kaleth could barely comprehend that such things actually happened. Navigator Lucy Chen had become particularly close to several young Kaleth, sharing star charts and discussing different approaches to space navigation. During one of these sessions, Zixathara noticed that Chen's charts contained far more detail than typical navigation aids. Entire sectors were marked with color-coded warnings, threat assessments, and tactical notes about defensive positions and escape routes. Chen explained that human navigation wasn't just about finding the fastest route from one place to another. Human navigators had to consider political situations, territorial disputes, pirate activity, hostile alien presence, and natural hazards that could be used as weapons or defenses. Every star system in human space came with detailed files about its strategic importance, defensive capabilities, and potential for use in warfare. "We assumed that every piece of space might become a battleground someday," Chen said, while showing Zixathara a chart that looked more like a military strategic assessment than a navigation aid. "So we prepare for that possibility." The human went on to describe how civilian shipping routes were planned with military considerations in mind, how colonies were established with defensive potential as a primary concern, and how even peaceful exploration missions carried detailed contingency plans for hostile contact. Dr. Lisa Park had spent considerable time in the Kaleth science labs, supposedly sharing research data and learning about their technological approaches. Zixthera observed these interactions and slowly realized that Park was conducting a systematic intelligence-gathering operation disguised as scientific cooperation. The human scientist asked detailed questions about Kaleth manufacturing capabilities, resource extraction methods, communication systems, and transportation networks. Park seemed particularly interested in Kaleth weaknesses and limitations. She wanted to know what resources the Kaleth couldn't produce themselves, what technologies they lacked, what environmental conditions would be harmful to them, and what social or psychological pressures might disrupt their society. When questioned about this focus, Park smiled and said she was simply trying to understand how the two species might best cooperate in the future. As the journey continued, Zixthera began to notice patterns in human behavior that hadn't been apparent during the initial rescue. The humans never seemed to fully relax, even in the safe environment of the Kaleth ship. They maintained what they called situational awareness at all times, constantly monitoring their surroundings and the behavior of everyone around them. Even during meals and social activities, the humans positioned themselves with clear views of exits and kept their emergency equipment within easy reach. They spoke in code phrases that other humans understood, but that sounded like casual conversation to Kaleth ears. They rotated their schedules so that trained fighters were always awake and alert, maintaining what Hayes called watch rotations, even during peaceful hyperspace travel. The most disturbing realization came when Zixthera understood that everything the humans did served multiple purposes. Their cultural exchange sessions were intelligence-gathering operations. Their medical cooperation included detailed studies of Kaleth physiology that could be used for either healing or harming. Their technical assistance came with systematic analysis of Kaleth capabilities and vulnerabilities. The humans weren't being deceptive, Zixthera realized. They were simply operating according to survival principles that assumed every new relationship might someday become hostile. They prepared for friendship and cooperation, but they also prepared for betrayal and conflict with equal thoroughness. For humans, this wasn't paranoia. It was simply intelligent planning in a universe they had learned to expect the worst from. The alarms began screaming in the middle of what should have been a peaceful sleep cycle, and Zixthera felt their blood freeze as they recognized the pattern. Long-range sensors had detected massive objects dropping out of hyperspace at the edge of the system, moving with purpose toward the combined fleet. The Kaleth bridge crew moved with the careful precision of a species that had protocols for every situation, but Zixthera could see the uncertainty in their movements as their instruments registered readings unlike anything in their databases. Captain Morthak called for immediate consultation with the human leadership, and within minutes, Captain Jake Morrison appeared on the main screen. What struck Zixthera immediately was how different the human looked compared to just moments ago. Gone was any trace of the grateful refugee, replaced by something cold and calculating that made the xenobiologist's skin crawl. Morrison's eyes held a predatory focus as he studied the sensor readings, and when he spoke, his voice carried absolute authority. "Those are devourer ships," Morrison said. And Zixthera noticed how every human on the bridge immediately shifted into what could only be described as combat mode. They don't negotiate, they don't retreat, and they don't take prisoners. They're here to consume everything in this system, starting with us. Captain Morthak began the standard Kaleth first contact procedures, broadcasting mathematical sequences and peaceful intentions on all frequencies. The response came not in words, but in action, as the alien ships opened fire on a small asteroid cluster, systematically breaking it down into component materials that disappeared into massive processing. Bays, Zixathera watched in horror as the Devourers demonstrated their complete indifference to communication by consuming matter with mechanical efficiency. Captain, Morrison's voice cut through the Kaleth confusion like a blade. With respect, your people need to jump to hyperspace immediately. We'll buy you time to escape. The human began rattling off coordinates to what he called a fallback position, but Captain Morthak interrupted with typical Kaleth logic. Our weapons are superior, Morthak said confidently. Our shields are more advanced, our technology more sophisticated. Surely we can negotiate or, if necessary, drive them away with minimal conflict. Morrison's expression grew grim, and he turned to address someone off-screen. Amy, show them the Newcastle footage. Lieutenant Collins appeared beside Morrison, activating a holographic display that made Zixathera's stomach lurch. The recording showed a human colony world under attack by Devourer forces, and the xenobiologist watched in growing horror as advanced defensive systems proved utterly useless against enemies that simply absorbed the energy from weapon strikes and incorporated destroyed ships into their own growing fleet. Newcastle had better technology than you do, Morrison said quietly. Population of 12 million. We found the planet 18 hours later, stripped down to bedrock. They don't just kill you, they consume everything you ever were and add it to themselves. The Kaleth bridge crew stared at the recordings in stunned silence, but Zixathera noticed that the humans weren't watching the display. They were already moving with purpose, implementing plans they seemed to have prepared long before this moment. Dr. Lisa Park was at an engineering station, making modifications to ship systems with the kind of speed that suggested extensive prior planning. Ben Carter appeared on screen from the human ship, reporting that he was implementing Doomsday Protocol 7 with a casualness that chilled Zixathera to the bone. "What is Doomsday Protocol 7?" Captain Morthak asked, and Carter's response made everyone on the bridge go quiet. "We turn the ship into a bomb," Carter said simply. "Everything becomes a weapon. Life support, navigation, communications, even the waste recycling system. If we're going to die anyway, we make sure we take as many of them with us as possible." Zixathera watched in fascination and terror as the humans transformed before their eyes. Dr. Sam Rodriguez appeared in the medical bay, not treating wounded, but preparing what he calmly described as battlefield stimulants and combat drugs that would keep humans fighting long past the point where injuries should have incapacitated them. Sergeant Hayes was distributing weapons to civilian refugees, including children who handled the deadly devices with shocking competence. Communications Officer Kate Williams had taken over the sensor array and was somehow extracting tactical information from the Devourer formations that the Kaleth computers had missed entirely. She was reading enemy intentions from ship movements, predicting their attack patterns, and broadcasting targeting information to human vessels with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. Navigator Lucy Chen appeared at the tactical station, not plotting escape routes but calculating intercept courses that would maximize damage to enemy vessels. Her charts now showed the system not as a place to flee from, but as a three-dimensional battlefield where every asteroid, every gravity well, and every energy source could be turned into a weapon against the approaching swarm. "All civilian ships, jump to coordinates Omega-7 immediately," Morrison ordered, and Zixathera noticed that the human refugees didn't argue or hesitate. They simply followed orders with the discipline of a military unit, even though most of them were supposedly farmers, merchants, and colonists. "Military vessels, form up for attack pattern Delta. We hold them here long enough for the civilians to escape." Captain Morthak protested that the Kaleth ships could provide support, but Morrison's response revealed something that made Zixathera's blood run cold. "Captain, with all respect, you've never fought anything that wanted to kill you. Your people think war is a negotiation with weapons. These things don't negotiate, and this isn't war. This is pest control, and we're the pests." The first Devourer. Ships entered effective weapons range, and Zixathera watched the Kaleth fleet open fire with their advanced energy weapons. The beams struck the alien vessels and seemed to have significant effect, tearing through what appeared to be organic armor and causing visible damage. For a moment, hope flickered on the Kaleth bridge as their superior technology proved effective. Then the damaged Devourer ships began to change. The organic hull material flowed like liquid, incorporating debris from destroyed sections and somehow adapting to resist the same weapons that had just hurt them. Within minutes, the Kaleth energy beams were having no effect at all, absorbed harmlessly by hull plating that had evolved specifically to counter them. "They learn," Morrison said grimly. "Every weapon you use, they adapt to. Every tactic you try, they counter. The only way to fight them is to keep changing, keep adapting, faster than they can respond." He turned to his own crew with orders that sounded like madness to Kaleth ears. "All ships, implement random tactical variation. No pattern longer than 30 seconds. No weapon configuration used twice." Zixthara watched in amazement as human ships began attacking with chaotic unpredictability that somehow formed a coherent strategy. One moment they were using energy weapons, the next they switched to projectile cannons, then to ramming attacks, then to something Dr. Park called viral torpedoes that seemed to carry some kind of biological agent designed to disrupt Devourer ship functions. The humans weren't just fighting, they were experimenting in real time, testing different approaches and sharing successful techniques across the fleet faster than seemed possible. When Commander Turner discovered that Devourer ships were vulnerable to a specific type of electromagnetic pulse, every human vessel modified their weapons to produce that effect within minutes. Lieutenant Collins led boarding parties onto damaged Devourer ships, not to capture them, but to plant explosive charges and gather intelligence about enemy capabilities. The humans moved through the alien vessels like they belonged there, adapting to hostile environments and unknown threats with terrifying efficiency. But what disturbed Zixthara most was the transformation in human behavior. These beings, who had seemed grateful and peaceful just hours ago, were now hunting with predatory joy. They weren't just defending themselves, they were learning how to kill more effectively with every passing moment, and they seemed to be enjoying the challenge. The battle had been raging for 3 hours when Zixthara began to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history. The Devourers, who had consumed countless species across the galaxy without significant resistance, were not just being fought to a standstill by primitive humans, they were losing. More disturbing still was how the humans were winning, not through superior technology or overwhelming force, but through an approach to warfare that seemed fundamentally different from anything the xenobiologist had ever imagined. Dr. Lisa Park had converted the Kaleth Science Lab into what she called a tactical analysis center, and Zixthara watched in fascination as the human scientist dissected enemy capabilities in real time. Park wasn't just studying Devourer technology, she was reverse engineering their biological processes while the battle continued around them. Using tissue samples from destroyed enemy vessels, she had identified 17 different vulnerable points in Devourer physiology and was already developing targeted weapons to exploit each weakness. "They're not really machines and not really animals," Park explained while working on her 4th different type of anti-Devourer weapon. "There's something in between, which means they have vulnerabilities from both categories. They're organic. Components can be poisoned, their mechanical parts can be disrupted, and the interface between the two systems can be confused with the right electromagnetic frequencies." What chilled Zixthara was the speed at which Park worked. The human scientist wasn't carefully testing hypotheses over extended periods like Kaleth researchers would do. She was making educated guesses, testing them immediately in combat conditions, and refining her approach based on battlefield results. When one of her experimental weapons proved effective, she had manufacturing instructions transmitted to every human ship within minutes. Commander Alex Turner had taken personal command of a fighter squadron, and Zixthara monitored his communications with growing unease. Turner wasn't just piloting his craft, he was conducting live experiments in combat tactics, trying increasingly dangerous maneuvers to test devourer response patterns. When he discovered that enemy ships had difficulty tracking targets that moved in specific irregular patterns, he immediately shared the technique with other pilots and began developing more advanced variations. "The key is unpredictability," Turner explained during a brief communication lull. "They adapt to patterns, so we don't use patterns. Every attack run is different, every approach angle is unique, every weapon combination is something they haven't seen before." The human pilot spoke of risking his life to test unproven tactics as if it were simply part of routine job responsibilities. Turner's squadron was performing maneuvers that should have been suicidal, using their ship's destruction as weapons. By timing exactly when to eject and when to let momentum carry their exploding craft into enemy weak points. The humans weren't just sacrificing themselves, they were calculating how to make their deaths mathematically more destructive than their lives had been. Dr. Sam Rodriguez had transformed the medical bay into something that made Zixathara deeply uncomfortable. The human doctor was no longer just treating wounded, he was enhancing healthy humans for more effective combat performance. Rodriguez had developed stimulants that increased reaction time, painkillers that allowed severely wounded humans to continue fighting, and something he called battle cocktails that seemed to eliminate fear responses while maintaining tactical thinking. "The human body has natural limitations designed for survival," Rodriguez explained, while preparing another batch of combat drugs. "But survival isn't always the primary objective. Sometimes you need to push past biological safeguards to accomplish the mission." The doctor spoke of deliberately overriding human self-preservation instincts as if it were standard medical practice. More disturbing still was watching the humans who had received Rodriguez's treatments. They moved with inhuman speed and precision, showing no reaction to injuries that should have incapacitated them, fighting with mechanical efficiency while somehow retaining the creative thinking that made human tactics so unpredictable. They had become something more dangerous than baseline humans, and they had done it voluntarily. Communications Officer Kate Williams had achieved something that the Caleth computers had declared impossible. She was intercepting and decoding Devourer communications in real time. Williams had somehow identified patterns in enemy transmissions and was using them to predict Devourer strategy. But that wasn't the disturbing part. The disturbing part was what she was doing with that information. Williams wasn't content with just listening to enemy communications. She was sending false signals that confused Devourer coordination and turned their own tactics against them. She had learned their command frequencies and was broadcasting orders that caused enemy ships to fire on each other, to move into disadvantageous positions, and to waste resources on non-existent threats. "They have a very structured communication system," Williams explained while simultaneously listening to enemy chatter and composing false orders. "Once you understand the hierarchy and command protocols, you can make them do almost anything. They're actually easier to manipulate than most species because they follow orders without question." Navigator Lucy Chen had turned the entire star system into a weapon, using gravitational calculations that impressed even Caleth scientists. Chen was plotting courses that used stellar phenomena to tear apart Devourer ships. She guided enemy vessels into solar flares, lured them into asteroid fields that became kinetic bombardments, and somehow managed to use the system's gas giant as a gravitational slingshot to accelerate human projectiles to devastating velocities. "Every star system is a three-dimensional battlefield," Chen explained, while calculating an intercept course that would use a comet's trajectory to deliver a nuclear warhead to a Devourer command ship. Gravity, radiation, magnetic fields, orbital mechanics, everything becomes a potential weapon if you understand the physics well enough. What amazed Zixathara was how Chen made these calculations under combat stress, adjusting her plans in real time as conditions changed and somehow managing to stay ahead of enemy movements. The human navigator was thinking dozens of moves ahead like some kind of three-dimensional chess master, except the pieces were starships, and the stakes were species survival. Sergeant Rick Hayes had done something that defied Kaleth understanding of military organization. He had turned civilian refugees into an effective fighting force. The farmers, merchants, and colonists who had seemed helpless just days ago were now operating with the coordination of trained soldiers, following complex, tactical plans and adapting to changing conditions with impressive flexibility. Every human learns basic combat skills, Hayes explained, while directing a group of teenagers in a flanking maneuver against a damaged Devourer vessel. We don't really have non-combatants, just people with different specialties who can all fight when necessary. These folks aren't soldiers, but they understand how to follow orders and how to stay alive in dangerous situations. Zix Thara watched 12-year-old human children operating weapon systems with competence that would have impressed Kaleth military specialists. Elderly refugees were analyzing tactical displays and providing strategic recommendations that experienced warriors immediately implemented. The entire human civilian population had become a military asset, not through conscription or coercion, but through cultural preparation that began in childhood. But the most disturbing observation was how much. The humans seemed to be enjoying themselves. Despite facing extinction at the hands of galaxy-consuming monsters, they approached each tactical challenge with enthusiasm that bordered on excitement. They weren't just fighting for survival, they were learning from every encounter and becoming more effective with each passing hour. Lieutenant Amy Collins appeared on the main screen, reporting from inside a captured Devourer ship. Her face was streaked with something that might have been blood or alien bodily fluids, her equipment showed battle damage, and her expression held a satisfaction that made Zixathara's skin crawl. "We've figured out how to turn their own systems against them," Collins said with obvious pleasure. "Give us 6 more hours and we'll have them eating each other." The Devourer fleet began its retreat after 8 hours of continuous battle, but Zixthara noticed that the humans showed no signs of celebration or relief. Instead, they immediately began salvage operations, studying the wreckage of enemy ships, with the same methodical intensity they had shown during combat. Captain Morrison stood on the bridge of the Aurora Dawn, coordinating recovery efforts with the calm efficiency of someone performing routine maintenance rather than analyzing the remains of galaxy-consuming monsters. "We need to understand everything about them before the main swarm arrives," Morrison explained to Captain Morthak, and Zixthara felt a chill run through their body at the casual way the human discussed future encounters with these horrors. This was just a scouting force, maybe 300 ships. The real swarm will have thousands, possibly tens of thousands of vessels, and they'll be prepared for everything we used against this group. Zixthara watched Dr. Lisa Park leading teams through the twisted wreckage of Devourer ships, collecting samples and studying technology with scientific precision. But this wasn't the careful, methodical research approach the Kaleth would use. Park was conducting battlefield analysis, extracting useful information under time pressure, and immediately applying her discoveries to practical applications. Their biological components follow predictable evolutionary patterns, Park reported while dissecting what appeared to be a Devourer control system. They adapt quickly to specific threats, but they're vulnerable to broad-spectrum attacks that target multiple systems simultaneously. More importantly, they seem to have some kind of shared learning network, which means everything we do against them gets transmitted to the main swarm. The implications of Park's discovery struck Zixathara like a physical blow. The humans had not only survived an encounter with the Devourers, they had learned how the enemy shared information across their entire species. And rather than being discouraged by this knowledge, the humans seemed energized by the tactical challenge it represented. Commander Turner was examining the flight patterns of destroyed Devourer craft, using their final movements to extrapolate information about enemy strategy and capabilities. Turner's analysis revealed that the Devourers had been testing human responses just as much as the humans had been studying them, which led to a disturbing conversation that Zixthara monitored with growing unease. They know how we fight now, Turner said during a strategic planning session. Every tactic we used, every weapon we deployed, every maneuver we tried, they've recorded it all, and they're already developing counters. Instead of being concerned by this revelation, Turner smiled with what could only be described as anticipation, which means we get to be creative. Zixthara listened as the humans began planning not just for the next encounter with the Devourers, but for a long-term campaign that would span multiple battles across numerous star systems. They discussed strategies that involved deliberately sacrificing entire colonies to gather intelligence, tactics that required coordinating military actions across hundreds of light years, and weapons development projects that would take years to complete. The xenobiologist realized with growing horror that the humans weren't just preparing to defend themselves against the Devourer swarm. They were preparing to hunt them across the galaxy. Dr. Rodriguez approached Zixthara during the salvage operations, carrying a datapad filled with biological analysis that made the Kaleth observer profoundly uncomfortable. Rodriguez had been studying not just Devourer physiology but human performance during combat, and his conclusions revealed something disturbing about the species Zixthara had initially viewed as primitive refugees. Humans are actually poorly designed for peaceful coexistence, Rodriguez said matter-of-factly, while showing Zixthara brain scans of human combatants. Our neurological structure is optimized for threat assessment, rapid decision-making under stress, and coordinated violence against competing groups. We're much better at fighting than we are at almost anything else. Rodriguez went on to explain that human biology included redundant systems for surviving massive trauma, neurological adaptations for functioning effectively under extreme stress, and psychological mechanisms that actually improved performance during life-threatening situations. Humans, the doctor revealed, were essentially biological weapons that had achieved sentience. Most species evolve intelligence as a way to avoid violence, Rodriguez continued. Humans evolved intelligence as a way to be more effective at violence. Everything else, art, science, philosophy, technology, those are just side effects of developing better ways to kill things that threaten us. Zixthara found themselves studying the humans around them with new eyes, seeing not grateful refugees, but predators who had temporarily set aside their natural aggression to focus on a more pressing threat. The casual competence with which human children handled weapons, the automatic way adults positioned themselves for tactical advantage, the constant awareness of potential threats. These weren't learned behaviors. They were instinctual responses, refined by countless generations of warfare. Communications Officer Kate Williams made a discovery that changed everything Zixthara thought they understood about the galactic situation. While analyzing intercepted Devourer communications, Williams had identified references to other species that had encountered the swarm, and the results were consistently identical: complete consumption with no significant resistance. They've been doing this for thousands of years, Williams reported during a briefing that included both human and Kaleth leadership. Hundreds of species, maybe thousands, all consumed without ever developing effective countermeasures. They have a standard operating procedure for every type of resistance they've encountered, except for one thing. Williams paused, and Zixthara noticed that every human in the room was smiling with predatory anticipation. They've never encountered a species that fights back effectively, Williams continued. Every other race they've consumed tried to negotiate, or flee, or defend static positions. None of them tried to hunt the hunters. Captain Morrison stood to address the mixed group of humans and Kaleth, and his words revealed the true scope of human ambition in a way that made Zixthara's blood run cold. The Devourers think they're apex predators, Morrison said with calm certainty. They've spent millennia consuming civilizations that couldn't fight back effectively. But they've never encountered humans before, and they don't understand what they're dealing with. Morrison activated a holographic display showing star charts that covered thousands of light years, marked with tactical annotations and strategic assessments that represented planning on a galactic scale. "We're not going to defend against them," Morrison announced. "We're going to exterminate them, every ship, every installation, every individual devourer in the galaxy. We're going to hunt them down and kill them all, and we're going to use their own tactics against them." The plan Morrison outlined was breathtaking in its scope and terrifying in its implications. Humans would establish hidden bases throughout Devourer territory, using captured enemy technology to avoid detection. They would study Devourer biology until they understood it better than the creatures understood themselves. They would develop weapons specifically designed to exploit every weakness in Devourer physiology and psychology. Most disturbing of all, the humans planned to use their greatest advantage against the Devourers: their ability to learn and adapt, faster than any enemy could respond. While the Devourers had evolved to consume static civilizations, humans had evolved to fight other humans, which meant they were already optimized for warfare against intelligent, adaptable opponents. The Devourers made one critical mistake, Morrison concluded. They assumed that intelligence and civilization make species less dangerous. For humans, it's the opposite. The more advanced we become, the more effective we are at killing things. As the briefing ended and the humans began implementing their galactic extermination plan with cheerful efficiency, Zixathara realized that they had completely misunderstood the situation from the beginning. The humans weren't refugees fleeing from the Devourers. They were an invasive species that had just been introduced to a new ecological niche, and they intended to fill that niche by consuming everything that had previously occupied it. The Devourers, who had terrorized the galaxy for millennia, had encountered something that terrified them in return, a species that was better at being monsters than they were. 3 days after the first Devourer attack, long-range sensors detected the main swarm approaching the system, and Zixathara finally understood why the humans had seemed so calm about their victory over the scouting force. The massive fleet emerging from hyperspace stretched across several light minutes of space, containing more ships than the Kaleth had ever seen in one place. This was the force that had consumed entire civilizations, and it was moving toward them with the inexorable certainty of a natural disaster. Captain Morrison stood on the bridge of the Aurora Dawn, studying the sensor readings with the same expression Zixathara had seen him use when examining interesting technical specifications. Around him, his crew moved with quiet efficiency, implementing plans they had apparently prepared during the brief respite after the first battle. There was no panic, no desperate activity, just the methodical preparation of a species that had been planning for this exact scenario. "All civilian vessels jump to coordinates Sigma 9, Morrison ordered, and Zixathara noticed that the evacuation proceeded with military precision. Human refugees moved to their assigned ships without argument or confusion, carrying prepared emergency kits and following protocols they had obviously rehearsed. These weren't panicked civilians fleeing disaster, they were tactical assets being repositioned according to predetermined strategic plans. Captain Morthak approached Morrison with an offer that revealed the fundamental difference between their species. "Our ships will stand with you," the Kaleth commander said. "We cannot allow such evil to consume innocent beings without resistance." Morrison's response chilled Zixathara to the bone. "Captain, with all respect, your people don't belong in this fight. You see this as good versus evil, civilization against barbarism. That's not what this is." The human paused, choosing his words carefully. "This is predator versus predator, and your species isn't equipped for that kind of warfare." Before Morthak could respond, Morrison made an offer that revealed the true scope of human planning. "But we would be honored to have Kaleth observers document what happens here. Someone should record how the Devourer threat finally ends." Zixathara found themselves assigned to monitor human activities from a safe distance, and what they witnessed over the following hours shattered every assumption they had held about civilization, warfare, and the nature of intelligent species. The humans didn't meet the devourer swarm in traditional battle formation. Instead, they scattered their forces throughout the system according to a pattern that seemed chaotic until Zixathara began to understand its underlying logic. Every human ship was positioned to serve multiple tactical functions: weapons platform, sensor relay, communication hub, and if necessary, guided missile. The humans had turned the entire star system into a single massive weapon pointed at the approaching swarm. Dr. Lisa Park appeared on the communication screen, reporting from what she called a mobile research platform, and her casual tone while describing planet-killing weapons made Zixathara's skin crawl. Park had spent the 3-day respite developing what she termed biological cascade weapons, designed to exploit the shared neural network that connected all devourer organisms. "We're not just fighting their ships," Park explained while making final adjustments to devices that looked innocent, but carried labels like Species Termination Protocol and Extinction Event Generator. "We're targeting their collective consciousness. Once these weapons activate, every devourer in the galaxy will experience simultaneous neurological shutdown." The xenobiologist realized that Park wasn't describing weapons designed to win a battle. She was describing weapons designed to commit genocide on a galactic scale, and she spoke of species extermination with the same matter-of-fact tone she had used to discuss equipment repairs. Commander Turner led the opening assault with tactics that defied every principle of military strategy Zixathara had ever studied. Instead of coordinated formations attacking specific targets, human pilots operated independently, using seemingly random attack patterns that somehow created devastating combined effects. Turner's squadron didn't just attack devourer ships. They herded them like livestock, forcing the enemy fleet into predetermined positions where other human forces could exploit gravitational weapons and stellar phenomena. "The key is making them think they're winning," Turner explained during a brief communication as his fighter performed maneuvers that should have been physically impossible. "Let them adapt to our obvious tactics while the real weapons get into position." Turner's ship exploded moments later, but Zixathara watched the wreckage follow a precise trajectory that delivered a nuclear warhead to a devourer command vessel with mathematical perfection. Dr. Rodriguez had done something that violated every ethical principle of medical practice Zixathara could imagine. The human doctor had created what he called volunteer conversion protocols that transformed willing humans into something beyond recognition. The converted humans moved with inhuman speed and coordination, showed no response to injuries that should have killed them, and demonstrated tactical thinking that seemed to operate at a level beyond individual consciousness. "We're not changing their humanity," Rodriguez explained while monitoring the vital signs of warriors who no longer registered as entirely human. "We're just removing the biological limitations that prevent humans from reaching their full potential." The doctor spoke of deliberately mutating his own species as if it were routine medical treatment. Communications officer Kate Williams had achieved something that made Zixathara question the fundamental nature of reality. Williams had not only cracked the devourer collective consciousness, she had figured out how to become part of it. Using captured enemy technology and biological samples, Williams was somehow accessing the shared mental network that connected every devourer in the galaxy. "I can see through their eyes," Williams reported, while simultaneously controlling human forces and manipulating enemy communications. "I can feel their confusion as they try to understand what's happening to them. They've never encountered resistance like this, and their collective mind is starting to fracture from the psychological stress." Williams went on to explain that she was feeding false information directly into the devourer hive mind, creating phantom threats and non-existent opportunities that caused the enemy swarm to waste resources and maneuver into disadvantageous positions. She wasn't just fighting the devourers, she was driving them insane. Navigator Lucy Chen had turned the laws of physics into weapons on a scale that dwarfed anything Zixathera had thought possible, using calculations that seemed to treat entire star systems as components in a vast machine. Chen was manipulating gravitational fields to create what she casually described as localized space-time distortions. "We're not just using this system's gravity wells," Chen explained, while somehow causing a gas giant to shift its orbit in ways that violated several fundamental principles of celestial mechanics. "We're reshaping the local space-time continuum to make it hostile to devourer technology." Chen spoke of rewriting the laws of physics as if it were a routine navigation problem. Sergeant Hayes appeared on screen from what he called a forward observation post, and Zixathera realized with growing horror that the human was broadcasting from inside a captured devourer command ship. Hayes and his team had somehow infiltrated the enemy flagship and were systematically taking control of devourer systems from within. "Turns out their security is designed to keep people out, not to deal with people who are already inside," Hayes reported while casually describing how his team was using devourer technology to broadcast Park's biological weapons directly into the enemy collective consciousness. "Give us another hour, and we'll have complete control of their command structure." But the moment that truly revealed the nature of humanity came when young Lucy Chen, barely 16 years old, appeared on screen with a request that made Zixathera's blood freeze. Chen was asking for permission to implement what she called the final solution, and her casual tone while describing galactic genocide made the xenobiologist realize that humans didn't just excel at violence, they had made it into an art form. "We've identified the location of the devourer homeworld and their primary breeding installations," Chen reported with the same enthusiasm she had shown when discussing star charts. "We can modify our biological weapons to target their reproductive systems and render their entire species extinct within a single generation." Captain Morrison's response revealed the true scope of human ambition in a way that left Zixathera speechless with terror. "Approved," Morrison said simply. "Implement total species termination protocols. Make sure none of them survive to threaten anyone else." As Zixathera watched human children casually discussing the extermination of a galactic threat with the same matter-of-fact tone they used for routine chores, the xenobiologist finally understood the title of the report they would eventually write. The real terror wasn't that humans were effective warriors. The real terror was that they approached warfare with the same systematic thoroughness they brought to every other activity, and they had spent their entire evolutionary history perfecting techniques for killing things that wanted to kill them.